Let's start with the talk. I've modified the title that Dave gave me. I've broadened it. And I've really want to reflect on the relationship between science and the scientific approach and maybe the scientific method and lean. And how do they fit together? What does this really mean? And what does this mean for the future of the lean movement? So here are a few thoughts. The relationship between science and management has been a tortuous one. And indeed, the empirical basis for the establishment of the first attempt, the scientific management attempt, actually was based upon, let's call it politely, a lack of rigid experimentation. In fact, turns out that most of the apocryphal stories of the Hawthorne experiments and all of Mr. Taylor's, Frederick Taylor's experiments with pig iron handling and so on, actually they were mostly fictitious. There is no evidence that those experiments ever actually happened. They're apocryphal stories that were very powerful stories, but you can hardly call them an empirical basis to establish a new discipline. If you've read The Management Myth, which is a terrific book, it describes in great detail how apocryphal those stories were and how this was basically creating a narrative that met a need. There were a lot of people looking at the early part of this century in the United States and elsewhere to establish a credibility for a profession of management. And these stories met that need. And it's surprising that they have never, ever really been challenged until fairly recently, when people have gone back and said, well, what was the empirical basis for the insights that later on became combined in scientific management? And the truth is they didn't exist. So that's very interesting. That's not a great basis to start with, is no science or no experimentation. However, it met the need to legitimize the narrative that people needed to legitimize the role of management. And also, very importantly, to legitimize the role of experts and consultants. It's been a feature of management ever since. And it led to a focus that did become more scientific and did become much, much more practice-based and evidence-based over time, building the whole vertical control structure of the strategic allocation of resources and then the whole planning and budgeting process, which is essentially about the utilization of resources. That vertical organization actually was a major contribution that scientific management made to modern management. But what it left out, or what it left us with, was also a great deal of ambiguity over the role of the workforce, of the shop floor, over the whole question of incentives and motivation, which has been argued about ever since, but essentially was anecdotal to the story, to the extent that the requirement was basically to find a way of getting people to do what the vertical system actually needed doing. So that is actually the contribution of this original attempt to introduce science into management. And it left us, let's completely decry it for all the times we may want to rail against it. It actually was the foundation for a substantial trend rate of growth of productivity in the advanced countries and the advanced economies ever since. So it was a basis. It was a starting point. It was a piece of the story. When we then moved to modern management, Peter Drucker absolutely articulated the role of modern management and essentially defined the discipline for the professional educators of management, who were initially focused on management as a profession and later on became focused also on management as a way of justifying a narrative in society. Michael Porter, when he moved to the Harvard Business School from MIT and turned his economic knowledge on its head, essentially legitimized the role of business to escape the competition, to seek out premium profits. And that plus deregulation, those two things together actually provided the narrative, the essential narrative for investor capitalism. And we're now seeing not only in the financial sectors, we're seeing in global taxation of corporations and so on. We're seeing that the relationship between the state and society actually needs redefining again. And unfortunately, it looks like being redefined piecemeal rather than as a kind of global bargain. So that legitimization of investor capitalism, of course, led to the need to develop a continuing narrative to support it. And right from the Peters and Waterman, from the In Search of Excellence through Jim Collins, everybody has tried to correlate strategy and leadership with performance. And its success, I think, has been very minimal. It's a bit like trying to predict the stock market. A tremendous amount of scientific effort has gone into that with almost no significant results in terms of one way of predicting the stock market being better than the others. It's a random process. And likewise, the attempt to predict the performance of social organizations over a considerable period of time ends up with a handful of factors that even Tom Peters admitted were simply jotted down out of his head one day in his office. So hardly a scientific basis, but that was not the point. The point was essentially to justify investor capitalism and to provide a narrative that supported the heroic leader and the importance of the right form of strategy to try and escape the competition and to earn monopoly profits. At the same time, over the last few years, I think there was a hope in some quarters that the new web giants would be offering a different management model. And it's very interesting, those companies have grown extraordinarily quickly. And I think that's a feature of our time, is that when somebody gets a formula right, it suddenly becomes a major global phenomenon very, very quickly, much quicker than the growth of corporations in the past. And we're now into the second generation in a couple of those organizations. eBay is in the second generation, and Amazon is now, Apple is now in the second generation. And Amazon's got very big, and Google has got extremely big very quickly. And increasingly observing those companies and what's written about them, but observing those companies grappling with the problems of bigness, if you like, they are looking to lean in exactly the same way as other big corporations are. Apple, trying to build a product development process post-Jobs, is looking to lean. Lean experts from lean product development in very traditional industries. Amazon has had a very extensive lean program in its distribution and warehousing activities for a very long time. We've had a lot of connections over the years with that. And I'm also seeing from my contacts elsewhere very similar kinds of lean programs being organized in other companies like eBay that have grown very fast and now need to systematize and need to integrate and collaborate across vertical functions and so on. So for me, these organizations actually are not offering an alternative management model, which is kind of interesting. They're actually suffering from all the same issues as major companies get to when they get to that stage of very large, multidisciplined, vertically structured organizations. But what has happened in management in the university world, where the core management discipline, I think, has grown extraordinarily weak. The theoretical basis and the empirical basis for most of the management writing by the core management writers is minimal, is weak, is disappointing. But what has happened in the university world is obviously the money and the attention has been focused on the business world, and other disciplines who were previously would disdain from addressing management issues are actually now being drawn in and have been drawn in. And there are lots and lots of disciplines now contributing new stories and new insights and new empirical research that is actually shedding new light onto management. And that's very interesting and very encouraging for us, because I think it connects and enriches our understanding of the practice of lean as we have been progressing in our own experimentation. Things like behavioral economics, things like decision theory, things like neuroscience, things like psychology. Many of those disciplines are now providing the pop books, interesting books that used to be written by management authors are not written by management authors anymore. They're written by these disciplinary experts. So I think that's an encouraging sign, and one that we will need to connect with as the Lean movement moves forward. And just before I go, a very interesting demolition of most of the myths, of most of the attempts to apply science to management is nicely demolished in this wonderful book called The Halo Effect. So again, another interesting Christmas book to read. All of this has convinced me in recent months that actually Toyota is different. And Toyota remains a different management model, and one in which there is still a lot more to learn. And Toyota really is the outlier in terms of management practice, because they are being more rigorously, systematically successful in combining the insights from those disciplines into practice. And have combined, as I said last year, the insights from the quality movement, from the learning by doing movement, and from the process flow movements, if you like, into an operational synthesis that I still think is giving us a different basis, a basis for managing by science, as John Shook will call it. Toyota gives us a rigorous way of formulating strategy and deploying strategy. We're going to talk about that a lot. It gives us a rigorous way of defining value from the customer's perspective, about which we still are somewhat fuzzy. I think there is more to learn in this, particularly as we get to a stage where we have seen in detail how broken our current product designs and processes are, and begin to think about how clean sheet designs of alternatives in the future. Toyota also has given us a rigorous way of unblocking the horizontal flow of value creation, of seeing it for the first time and unblocking it. And we all know a lot about that. And it's given us the basis for a rigorous way of establishing standardized work as the foundation for continuous improvement. And of course, PDCA is the foundation of all of this. That is the scientific basis. Note though, scientists don't start with PDCA. Scientists start with CAPD. They start with checking the previous facts. Out of those previous facts, defining the questions that need to be answered next, where that knowledge applies, but actually what is formulating the next set of questions around which you can begin to plan. So CAPD is actually the scientific basis, not PDCA. Nevertheless, we know it is PDCA, so that's fine. And I think there are many ways you could actually now draw what a lean management system looks like. A solid basis of stability, of plan versus actual, visual plan versus actual, of deviations and so on, and problem solving everywhere along the value stream. A planning and focusing activity at the top. And two alternative activities, the vertical deployment of resources and the horizontal management of the horizontal value stream. Again, we know some about that, but that's the area that we know and we'll need to do more research into in the future. We know the tools, we kind of know what it looks like. But I think many of us are still struggling with how to move from what the management system we want to end up looks like, but how to get there. That remains, I think, the question. So I think there are 5 questions in trying to turn the what into hows, or how to create those whats. The first one is about how do we set direction and develop the capacity for change. Now, setting direction, fine. Policy deployment, yes, and we're going to hear a great deal about policy deployment. And we're going to hear quite a bit about leadership And we're going to hear quite a bit about Gemba learning and so on for executives in this conference. I am struck as I go around and talk to senior executives and look at the board's lists of projects and at the struggle to kind of define strategic objectives by big corporations and essentially the inability to really frame the questions in terms of gaps, performance gaps that need closing, as the formulation process at the beginning of a strategy deployment process. We are still, in most cases, locked in a political fight over resources and not an evidence-based focus on the deployment of those resources to most effect. And that seems to me to be where the biggest weakness in most organizations is no longer at the bottom, it's actually at the top. So we have a big job to understand how we get and communicate in a language that CEOs understand and executives understand, how to truly set direction and deploy and focus activities on the right things. We're going to hear more about that in this conference, so I'm not going to talk further about that. The second, and I said this is important, and I think this is going to be increasingly important as we think beyond our current assets and products and so on, is defining value from the customer's perspective. From the customer's perspective, understanding the customer's use of the product, understanding the context in which the customer is using the product, and so on and so forth. Again, I'm not going to talk a great deal about that, but I am sure this will be a topic for future summits. I've also become increasingly convinced that we have a richness of different perspectives in every organization. The functional pyramids, the functional silos, on the one hand are an obstacle to collaboration, on the other hand make the collaboration where you can make it work much richer. So how do we combine the different perspectives, not simply get everybody to think lean, but how do we combine the different perspectives effectively and make sure we're addressing the concerns that each perspective has as its own? And I want to show you an example of how we might go about doing that. How do we manage lean projects? I think Takashi has shown us over the last couple of years some of the elements of what I would call lean project management. But I think it's much more than that, and I think there is still a great deal for us to learn, and Takashi is going to share some more insights tonight on where that leads. A lot of issues and a lot of questions around that. And then finally, what does a lean transformation actually look like? Well, we've been doing a lot of thinking about that in the Lean Global Network over the last year. And John Shook and Dave and I and Renee and Jose as the executive team have been brainstorming what a lean transformation looks like. And I think we've come up with an interesting synthesis. You can put it in a house, if you like. But basically, a lean transformation is about defining and trying to address specific problems in a specific context. A specific gap that needs closing. Performance gap, capability gap, a specific gap that needs closing in order to address the purpose of that activity. Then the next step is to assess the capabilities we need in order to perform the actions to close that gap. And I say that deliberately in that order. We are trying to understand the capabilities we will need to develop in order to take the necessary actions to close the gap. So the capabilities and the operational improvement or the process improvement or whatever are the two major pillars of a transformation path. And that has to be led with leadership that on the one hand provides clear direction and on the other hand leads by asking questions and developing the capability of the people in the process. And the end objective of all of these activities in a lean transformation is actually the systematic use of PDCA by everyone in the organization. Now that's a very different sequence to the one that I think we're used to. The contrast would be, instead of specific business problems, I come along with a transformation ladder and a standard solution that I'm going to apply to your business. I would take everybody off and train them in a classroom in the tools. I would then deploy those tools and solve your problems by bringing in some experts to do it. And the leadership would be essentially do it for me leadership. Not involved, I'm hiring consultants, you got here to solve my problem for me. And that leads to consultant dependence, and it does not lead to the systematic use of PDCA by everyone. So it's a very different transformation model to the one that I think we're going to be using from here on out much more consciously. This is about building capabilities in order to solve problems. And the sensei's question, as John neatly captured in his email the other day, John Shook, is so what? The specific results of that PDCA cycle are fine. That's good. But, so what? The lasting value, of course, is the capability of that team to solve the next problem, and the next problem, and the next problem. That's the purpose of that activity. And we can only judge the success in doing that after the event. So Toyota actually judged the success of managers not by how well they were able to go and shake up their new responsible areas of responsibility, but on how well what they put in place was sustained, was how well the team was able to sustain that activity and grow that activity after you left and moved on to another position. That introduces a very interesting change again in how we would judge success. We judge success by the ability of the team to sustain it after you leave. And it's management's responsibility to focus these actions and on the needs of the business and on the needs of the business's customers. So management has to be able to see down into the detail, and management has to be able to focus the efforts and direct the efforts in the right direction. The people in the process not necessarily do not have the visibility or the responsibility to do that to the same extent. So let me summarize. The scientific approach basically is less, if you like, less complete than the scientific method. In most cases, and I say in most cases, we're not able to run blind trials as they would do in the medical field. And we have a less well-structured, at least at this point, peer-reviewed results reflection process. Nevertheless, as we are essentially in the business of trying to run experiments to develop capabilities, that activity absolutely, I think, can be subjected to scientific rigor. Where we fall down is looking for a law that those capabilities will automatically have these results. In a changing environment, even over time, but certainly in a social environment in which with multiple factors, you will never have the same predictable results. That's not the point. But what you probably can do is develop a better scientific evidence base for developing the capabilities. And then you can see a correlation between the capabilities and results. So what problem, what question are we trying to answer? What experiments do we then need to design? Who has gone through a course on design for experiments? You don't need to put your hands up here, but explicitly need to build that in if we're going to design experiments to answer those questions. And how will we assess the necessary capabilities and the mentoring and the management structure that will be necessary to answer those questions? So we're moving away from simply the technical solution to the problem to the capabilities and the structure and the management that will be necessary to solve that problem. And I think we are, again, my view has always been that one of the best ways of assessing capabilities, just one, is a portfolio of A3s. I can read from a portfolio of A3s the scope, the depth, the length of time, the depth of thinking, the thought process that takes us, just like you would judge a pilot's experience from judging their flight log. That kind of assessment is what I think is much more helpful in beginning to assess an organization and a collection of individuals' capabilities for change. We need to build on that. That's just a start. And then how do we complete the PDCA process? How do we capture the reflections and share these results through communities of practice within our organizations, but also across the Lean movement? And we are as guilty as everybody about doing PD, and off to the next job. And not spending time in writing up and reflecting enough. And that's a challenge for the Lean movement, is actually to do that, to create a platform, to create the ability to share. Through social media, that's going to be much more easier to do in the future. That becomes a task where we build an evidence base. Because what we're trying to do is not prove laws. We are aiming to develop capabilities, but actually what we're doing is creating stronger hypotheses, stronger bets to address future questions, because the future questions are never going to be exactly the same. But the past experience base gives us a much stronger starting point for addressing some of those. And how do we address, how do we build, how do we educate and develop our own senseis? A very important task that the Lean movement and every organization will need to think about in the future. So another thing to learn from Toyota. So some final thoughts. Are we actually in our Lean activities using science? Or are we simply riding a narrative? Riding a narrative just like Frederick Taylor and Mayo and Jim Collins are. And the narrative may be an important piece of part of our time, but actually are we contributing to it, or are we just riding a narrative? I think we have to be, if we're serious, we have to be using science to evaluate and plan our own work. And are we developing a body of practice, or are we trying to turn Lean into a profession? I am very nervous about turning Lean into a profession. And I have to say, there are some times when I go into organizations and the Lean team itself has professionalized, has fought for its place, and itself is finding it hard to develop a sensei coaching role as opposed to a deployment lead role. And I think we've got to be careful. I think the professionalization of Lean is actually not the point. Being the handmaidens or the nurses of a new set of capabilities in line management absolutely is. So that's something we need to think very carefully about. And finally, are we actually just using Lean to improve performance, to improve the profitability of our organizations? Is that really all we're doing? Is Lean just an improvement method? Doesn't Lean have a wider remit, a wider contribution to society? Aren't we also creating a more fulfilling way of learning and working? And again, we've deployed that so far in relation to improving performance of organizations, but there's a much wider role in society for showing methods, insights, results about how we can create more fulfilling work and how we can also meet growing aspirations of our societies, but also of the societies who are rapidly industrializing. How can we meet those resources, those aspirations, by creating sustainable communities, by using less resources and minimizing our environmental impact? We've not actually focused too much on that, but I think that will be increasingly important as the narrative we create about the contribution lean can make to society as a whole. If we just remain an improvement method, we will have a limited life. It will have plenty of life for our lifetimes, but actually will make a limited contribution. Lean, I think, has a lot more to offer. And let me leave you with a final thought. And that is what actually drives us, personally, individually. Are we driven to know what is known, or are we driven to ask the next set of questions? Very interesting book, which I urge you also to read for Christmas, a book called Ignorance, which is a restatement, a really fresh statement of what science is about. Science is about not the facts we know, but about, given the facts we know, looking at our challenges, defining the questions for the future that we don't know the answer to. So science is driven by ignorance, which I think is a great leaving thought. So if we're driven by that interest in the next set of questions, as I have been right throughout my career, then I think we are true to a scientific mission. If we're just happy to bumble along and interpret other people's insights, that's also fine, but I don't think we're being scientists. So I think we're being true scientists if we are actually personally driven by an interest in the next set of questions that occur to us in our work environment, that occur to us outside in society. If we're driven by those questions, and I certainly am, there's plenty of work to keep us going for the rest of our lives. Thank you very much indeed.